There's a very long question, so I'm going to read part of it and answer that and then go on. I'll put the whole thing in the description, of course. One attachment for me has been a desire to change other people, to help them see something. I have noticed that as I go up higher, attacks on me are lesser in the sense that I react less. But what has happened then is that the people around me have been attacked that are important to me, or rather to my ego. These people usually are in a state of consciousness where they suffer. They might not even admit this, but you can sense this. I have still remnants of this desire to help other people or help them to see their own bias. But the fallen beings use these other people to go into an emotional reaction. So it's every time some kind of drama that then many times creates confusion to me. Maybe I'm wrong, or some other forms of discouragement or doubt on the path. So let me comment on this, because this is a very common scenario on the spiritual path. I've seen many people who have experienced the same thing. I've certainly experienced it also. So, the basic idea, which I have mentioned in several other videos, is that we who are spiritual people, we are seen as the threat by the dark forces, which is primarily the fallen beings. I explained this in my video about how the world was created. So there are these beings, some of them in the physical, but many of them in the emotional, mental, and identity levels, the 4 levels of the universe, that are targeting us because they want to derail our growth if they can. And so what happens is that in the beginning, when you find the spiritual path, they will target you, and they will try to discourage you. They will try to stir up your emotions, whatever unresolved emotions you have. They'll try, if you have an emotional pattern of getting angry, for example, they'll try to get you to get angry. Or they'll try to project thoughts into your mind, a certain doubt. And so this is a very personally targeted attack. But as is also described in the question, as you go higher on the path, you become less and less vulnerable to this. And this is especially true if you use the techniques I've talked about in my spiritual toolbox playlist of invoking spiritual light from the Ascended Masters for your own protection, especially from Archangel Michael. You can call to an Elohim called Estrella to cut you free from any ties to these lower forces, and you use the violet flame to dissolve energy already in your energy field. So as you grow on the path, then you become less vulnerable to these attacks by the dark forces. And it's perfectly true, as the question says, then the dark forces will target individuals around you. And they will seek to create some kind of drama where these people are wanting to pull you into their drama, perhaps attacking you, accusing you in various ways. And this then can also distract you from the path. So what I have done for many years is to also make calls to the people for the people around me. Not just make calls for myself, but I make calls to Archangel Michael for the protection. And I usually just protect people in my sphere of influence. So in other words, the people who are in this sphere that I'm dealing with, I'm calling for their protection. I'm calling for them to be cut free. I'm calling for the dissolution or transformation of the lower energies in their energy fields. And of course, if there's a specific person you're dealing with, you can make specific calls for that person. It's not a matter of manipulating them. Because when people are trapped in one of these dramas, they don't really have free will. Their free will has been neutralized because they are so wrapped up in the drama. So you actually make calls to free their free will so they can make a better choice of not being in this drama. And so this is certainly one thing. But as the question also says here, that people who are important to me, or rather to my ego. And so this is the next step. You obviously should make the calls for protection, but you also need to consider, do you have one of these subconscious selves that ties you to a particular person and ties you to a particular drama with that person? And in that case, you need to look at yourself, you need to look at your psychology and discover, why is this so important to me? Why do I feel that, for example, I always have to defend myself when this person is attacking me? Or why do I feel that I always have to be there for that person? I always have to help that person. And when the person comes and wants something from me, I have to put aside everything else in my life and run to try and help that person, whom I can never really help anyway. Or why is there a certain person that whenever I give them what they ask, they just ask for more, and it becomes this never-ending spiral. You never really can satisfy the person. So you need to discover in yourself what subconscious self you have that makes you think, I have to respond to this person. And then you need to look at that, discover the illusion, and it probably ties in with more than just that person. It's probably how you respond to people in general, or at least people of with a certain psychology in general. And when you see that and you can let it go, then you are free of the drama. It doesn't mean that the other person won't approach you, but you have a different way of dealing with it now. You can be neutral about it instead of being sucked into a drama. And that's what a lot of my videos are about, where I talk about the subconscious selves. There are also tools from the Ascended Masters in my playlist about healing, for example, where you can discover these subconscious selves. And so, so this is the one thing you need to get to. Now the question goes on. I sense this is so because there is yet attachment where I don't respect the law of free will fully, where I have a self who thinks that this should not be happening, this suffering is avoidable, I should be able to help these people. Then when I don't see instant change, there is a reaction of feeling powerless, which of course exposes a desire of manipulation by these selves, which probably are selves that I created or accepted in reaction to some other event in the past in my life, and this keeps me attached to these people, my own unresolved psychology. And yes, that's very true. That is exactly what keeps us attached to other people. And it often is that we don't like to see other people suffer, especially people who are close to us, and therefore we want to help them. And you see this over and over again with people. You have, let's just talk about one person, but some people have more people like that, but one person always gets into trouble, always needs help, always makes these decisions that gets them into hot water, so to speak. And they always come to you for help. And you want to help them, but you see that no matter what they say, it doesn't help them because they don't want to change. In other words, they are in a pattern, they don't want to change the pattern. So they suffer. And you, out of your compassion, want them to not suffer, so you feel frustrated when you try to help them and it doesn't help, and then you start doubting yourself. Am I doing something wrong? And so forth. And you're not really doing something wrong, but you have, as the question also says, you have an attachment. And you have an attachment to helping other people, helping them escape suffering. And that's one of the things that many avatars, and I talk about this in my avatar psychology playlist, we came to Earth, we wanted to free people from suffering. And we often are in this pattern where we can't understand why people don't want to do what we tell them will help them get out of suffering. It's like some people just want to suffer. And the reality is, yes, they want to suffer because they haven't had enough of it. You see, the law of free will is very simple. On a planet like Earth, there are certain experiences people can have. Some are positive experiences, but some are experiences of suffering. And people are allowed to have any experience they want. That's the law of free will. For as long as they want, within certain limits. So, a person goes into a certain state of consciousness, and it may very well be that a person decides, I'm a powerless being. I don't want to make decisions. So they get into this pattern. They are making what the masters call avoidance decisions, because we can't escape making decisions unless we go into a coma. But so they go making these avoidance decisions that gets them into trouble. And in order to try to avoid the trouble, they make other decisions. So basically we can say this person, it's not that the person wants to suffer, but the person doesn't want to make decisions, doesn't want to look at the consequences of its decisions and learn from it. So the person hasn't had enough of that experience of being powerless, of not wanting to make decisions, not wanting to learn from its decisions. It hasn't had enough of that, and therefore, implicitly, indirectly, the person hasn't had enough of suffering. And we are not here to change people. If that is the experience that somebody wants to have, you need to respect their free will and say, okay, I'm allowing that person to have that experience. But what does that mean for me? Does that mean that I necessarily has to be one who's always holding their hand? You have a right to come to a point where you have overcome the attachment in your psychology, the subconscious self in your psychology, that makes you feel like you have to help these people. You have to come to a point where you say, okay, I see that I can't help these people. I don't want to. I've overcome the desire to help these people. So I have a right to say, then I don't need to be around them. I don't need to be there to always try to comfort them or pick up the pieces or help them in some way. I can just let them live the way they want to live, and then I allow myself to live the way I want to live. Okay, so what is at the moment confusing is that even as I can see this dynamic, I sense a fear of being free. It's like an addiction to this kind of behavior, which of course exposes another self through which I look at life that limits my perception and affects my behavior and my sense of identity. And that is actually a very important insight. And I can see it in myself, I can see it in many other people. We come to a point where we begin to see a pattern in our own psychology. But we are reluctant to let go of it. We are actually really reluctant to look at it. Because, as the person says, it's confusing that I see this dynamic, but a sense of fear being free. Well, the fear is also that there's something you are afraid to look at, you don't want to look at. And this is something I can definitely recognize. I mean, and I think for me at least, it was this, I'm afraid of seeing something in my psychology that will expose that I made a really bad mistake. And for a long time, when I started realizing about avatars, I was afraid that I made a very bad mistake of coming to Earth. And therefore, I was not ready to look at this. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't ask that question. And but you see, the fear is coming from a self. So what you are having here is you have this, what we can call a catch-22. You have one self that's causing you to go into this pattern of behavior, wanting to help other people. You are beginning to see the consequences of it. You see the consequences of the self. But you're not seeing the self. You're not seeing the illusion of the self. Now you have another self who's projecting at you that you shouldn't look at the self. You shouldn't look at the illusion, because there could be something really bad you would discover about you making this terrible mistake in the past. And I recognize this catch-22, and for a time it can be really confusing and paralyzing. But for me at least, what I did was I started, when I saw this, I started using the tools of the Ascended Masters. I started making the calls to invoke energy to transform the fear, because the fear itself is just energy that's pulling on your emotional body. And if you transform that, it won't have as much of a pull. And all of a sudden there comes this point where, now it doesn't seem as dangerous to look. The fear of looking isn't as strong anymore. And then you can start looking at the self. And it also helped me to realize that, well, what did I realize? Well, I realized, first of all, that I am a person who's willing to learn. I'm willing to look at my psychology. I'm willing to look at what decisions I made in the past, what illusions I took on, what selves I created, and overcome it. Because ultimately, I want to be free. And I also realized that because I am the conscious you, and this is again the magic of this teaching about the conscious you, is nothing on earth has changed me. Nothing on earth has defined me. Therefore, nothing on earth can hold me back unless I allow it to. Meaning, whatever mistake, whatever terrible mistake I might have made in the past, I can overcome it, I can transcend it, I can be free of it, and my I Am Presence will still learn a positive lesson from it. So all of a sudden, how bad could it be? And then there was the realization also that as long as I haven't looked at a self, I'm still dragging it with me. It's coloring my perception. It's affecting my entire attitude to life. And the only way to be free of it is to look. So I came to that point where I was willing to look at it, and I even started seeing that even before I came to Earth, even from a natural planet, I didn't have that full respect for free will because I thought suffering was wrong. Suffering shouldn't be happening. People should not be suffering. And part of that is really that you are observing from a surface level. People are trapped in a pattern. They're suffering. They're stuck in it. Why can't they get out of it? But you see, they can. They got into it by making a decision with their free will, however free it was, given their level of consciousness. But they made a decision. And they can get out of it by making a decision that negates or transcends the first decision. But in order to do that, they have to be willing to look at the first decision. And as long as they're not willing to look at the first decision, they haven't had enough of the experience that they're getting through the self they created. So if you respect their free will, you will not say, oh, they shouldn't be suffering, or they shouldn't still be suffering, they should get out of this suffering the moment I tell them to. You won't say that, because you will say, that person has decided to have this experience, they obviously haven't had enough of it, therefore I must just respect this, and if I can't help that person, let me move on to somebody I might be able to help. Or let me look at why I have this obsessive compulsive desire to help other people. So there's a lot of very subtle things we can discover about ourselves and our motivation for coming to Earth. And it's important to do this because that's the only way we're going to be free. I mean, ultimately, you're not going to ascend if you still have a desire to help other people on Earth. This will pull you back into embodiment. So I'm not saying everybody it's there in their divine plan to ascend after this lifetime, but for those of us who it is in our divine plan, we need to overcome all of these attachments. And we only overcome them by looking at them, which is another thing I realized that motivated me to look. And you can come to that point where you're not afraid to look at anything. And it took me a long time, because there was always I was willing to look at a lot of things in my psychology, but there were certain things I felt I wasn't ready to look at. But I came to a point where I could simply say to the Ascended Master, I could say, I'm willing to look at anything. Just show me what I haven't seen. And that's a good place to be, because when you do this, you actually feel an instant inner peace. Because there's nothing you need to be afraid of anymore. You don't need to be afraid to look at anything, because you know you can be free of it when you see it.